Okay, you've done brilliantly. I kind of thought, I don't know about you, but I'm better in the morning. So I've put most of the kind of heavy stuff in the first session. And we're now going to think a bit more practically in the second session and the third session, and a bit more, in a sense, chance for you to talk with each other and think about how this impacts your own situations. I've been quoting all these Methodists and all these Presbyterians, so I thought I'd better quote an Anglican, and who better than the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who's now in Cambridge. He said this: "Are there structures and patterns which let that basic event of encounter happen again and again? Because if not, the church has become something very different from where it started. It's become a community which says once there was an encounter with Jesus, and we like to remember that. We have to ask much more radically, how do we structure a community in which it goes on being possible, even likely, that people will meet Jesus, and in meeting Jesus, will want more people to meet Jesus?" And I think it's, if I'm honest, whole different churches I've been, from the most conservative to the most radical, you do, churches I've been involved in, you do have that sense that we're trying to remember something that happened a long time ago, and that's why we come together. And how do we create structures that actually that is a living reality for us now, that encounter with Jesus? In your strategy, it talks about worship being that encounter with the divine. And how is it possible that our structures help us to meet Jesus, and in meeting him, want more people to meet Jesus? So this session, I want us to think about what shape of church do we therefore need to be? What shape of church do we therefore need to be? And just to give you a bit of fun, for 5 minutes on your table, if you could change one structure in your church, what would it be and why? So you're in charge completely. You can change any one thing to help with this whole encountering God. What would it be, and why would you do that? Okay, 5 minutes to sort your churches out, starting from now. I would be fascinated to know what kind of things you were coming up with. So we do happen to have 2 microphones, one either side. And if anyone has got, they don't have to say it was their own personal, they can say it was their group's. But I think it'd be useful for us to hear what some of the structures would be that we might change. You don't have to do a big explanation, but what would some of those be? And if we use the mic, it means just everyone can hear.
Making sure that visitors who come feel really comfortable in worship rather than being made to feel alien because of these strange practices.
Great. Okay. Yep. Making visitors feel really welcome. That would be a structure you'd change. Other people, come on. What things did you have? Let's not be shy. Well done, Steve.
I'd stop worship for a year. We're just so worship focused. It would just give a chance for fresh imagination to emerge.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Oh, we got it going now. Come on.
The invisible force field around people who say that I can't speak to people. I can't do this. I can't do that because it's not my gifting.
Yep.
Without giving it a try to see if it is or isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.
Somebody at my table
suggested
we need to be praying that God blows our building up, so then we can build a more appropriate worship structure that's a bit friendlier and more mission oriented.
Yep. Sometimes our buildings don't help us, do they? Yep. Come on this side, you're losing out here. Come on. I like a bit of competition going. Yep.
Church services structured earlier in the day, such as 9:15 or 10:15.
Right, okay. Structured earlier in the day.
Yep.
I was going to say structured later in the day, but yes, I'd take that.
Forgive me, there's nothing wrong with an evening service.
Yep, thank you. No, thank you for that. Sir.
We could structure the whole thing from worship coming out from underneath a non-Indigenous perspective. to be able to make it relevant within the Indigenous people.
Yep.
And to be able to have worship. Like, I'll give you an example, quick example. If you go to a church, if you come to an Indigenous church, you would hear people singing accordingly in English. You would hear them read the Bible in English. You would do everything in English. And if you were to shut your eyes, you said you're not nowhere near an Indigenous worship.
Yep.
So you change the whole structure so that it becomes things will be done in language and all sorts of other things that are relevant to the people.
Yep. And that, of course, would be true of lots of different groups within our societies, wouldn't it? Thinking about how we connect in ways which enable people to understand. That's really what we're talking about in their natural way of understanding. Yes, ma'am.
We talked at our table a bit about some of the structures in our church and how the politics can sometimes get in the way of grassroots ministry.
Yep.
And how for us, in our particular context, being able to engage with people, with our local people, being able to talk to them, and yes, including things like language, is hugely important. But we need to have ways of being able to do that effectively.
Yep. There's something about making people, that welcome, seems to me, is making people feel at home, which actually might make us not feel at home. That's the other thing, isn't it? So.
Engage more with the community, serve the community, do a barbecue, whatever. Our church also does a calendar. We send a free calendar out to all the postal addresses in town.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Yes, where are the places we can connect with our communities?
Stop looking at the church as a building and more as a community, as a family that's ever expanding, and because of that, welcoming other people regardless, accept that we're all part of this family, every person on this world, and they all belong. So get rid of the little groups in the church, in the enclosed ones. Everyone belongs.
Yep, great, that sense of unity. Thank you.
I think I kind of relate to that, but a more ecumenical shape and less of a parochial denominational shape.
Yep, working together much more across our own divides as well,
With my home church, it's made a huge difference with having a mission-based budget, starting with the missional activities we want to be involved with and finding the money to carry out these activities.
Brilliant.
Rather than the other way around, is starting with money and what happens with that money.
Yep.
Our table suggested it's wonderful having balloons or banners up when there's celebrations happening, so that anyone driving past will think, hey, there's something happening, let's come in and join.
Yep, there's a party going on, definitely. Great, thank you.
Some way of encouraging partnering between some of the wealthier congregations and some of those who are struggling, particularly those with new expressions of what it means to be church, and looking at how we use our resources across the church perhaps more equitably, and then just encouraging that partnering.
Because we are in this together, aren't we? And I find Paul's stuff really fascinating about how we, those who are struggling are supported by other parts of the church that are not struggling, and et cetera, and Paul, part of the reason that Paul says that is that actually one day it might be the complete opposite, and you'll need that support and encouragement as well. Vicky?
We talked about two things. One was how we do communion, whether it's primarily feels like a kind of history lesson in what happened back then, or whether it in fact articulates that we ourselves are becoming the body of Christ together as we partake of these, this bread and this wine. So that says something perhaps about how we do our liturgy or words around that. And the other thing we talked about was when we meet to worship, and whether worshipping on Sunday morning is the right time, because that's the precious time for most secular people to actually sleep in and have a brunch and all of those things. Maybe later in the morning, maybe midday, or maybe Friday night, or other things like that.
Yep, brilliant. Thank you, Vicky.
Celebrating the simple little ministries that people have in the community, whether it's part of a footy club or whatever, instead of just ignoring that and saying that's part of their other life, celebrating that.
Brilliant. Without that kind of sacred secular divide as well, I think is is really important. Thank you. Those were great. Thank you for those people that came up. In the UK, and this is partly what I came to talk about last time, one of the ways that we've most been reshaping the church is around this whole thing of fresh expressions of church, and that's what I came to talk about, and you decided to take that forward as a synod. And I just thought I would update you. Since I've been here, we've been doing 2 years of research project on what's been happening. And I just thought I'd encourage you by saying this is what's been happening. The research takes so long. They've only done 10 dioceses in the Church of England. It's Church of England. It's just partly because it's easy to get the figures by the way that the Church of England keeps their figures. And 10 dioceses is about a quarter of the Church of England. So it's a good survey. Out of that, they found on average 10% of people now attending church are attending a fresh expression. And 15% of church communities are fresh expressions of church, which is remarkable. I mean, for the Church of England, it is a miracle. And in 7 out of those 10 dioceses, it reversed the decline in church attendance that had been going on for the number of people that were added. There are loads of ways of doing this. So they saw 20 different models of fresh expressions and said they were completely across socio-economic and cultural groups. And one of the other encouraging things was that the starting team of these things is small, between, on average, 3 to 12 people. And the average size of these things is small as well, 44 people. So what's happening is lots and lots of small things. We've just done some research, which isn't included in this, in the diocese I help out, Ely Diocese, which is mostly rural, 1 or 2 small towns and Cambridge, and then everything else rural. And we found that out of 300 churches, many of them tiny, rural, 5, 10 people, that we have now 60 fresh expressions happening, and mostly in those rural areas. And the other encouraging thing is that 52% of these are led by lay people. And of those, 2/3 are female. But the statistic that has astounded us all is this, that of those attending these fresh expressions, 77% of people are from outside church. 44% have never had any contact with church, and 33% have had contact in the past but had stopped going, whether it was as a child or an adult or whatever. And that, because one of the kind of anecdotes that went round was, oh, these are great things, but it's just attracting bored Christians. And if you think that most of these fresh expressions started with a small team of Christians, 77% seems to me is probably everyone else, basically. It is quite remarkable. The other thing I would want to encourage you is that this has been happening for 10 years, and the statistics found that the biggest growth has been in the last 4 years. So there was 6 years of small growth, and then it's taken off. And what I found in Australia as I've gone around is a danger of people saying, oh, we've tried this for a couple of years, it's not working. And this is a long-term thing, and I really want to encourage you as a synod about this. If I'm honest, I kind of, since I've been here, not quite sure where you are with all this fresh expression stuff. And I'd really encourage you that this is a long-term thing and to kind of keep going with it. And because it takes time to embed this. The Methodist Church have been doing their own research as well, and they're saying they've got 1,500 fresh expressions with over 40,000 people coming to this. As I said, in a way, this is just one expression of doing it that we're doing in the UK, but as a way of saying, how do we reshape church to enable us to connect with the majority of our nation who are outside church? We are the minority now. We are the margins. So how do we reconnect our church with our communities? And that is, we are going to have to change. So, what I want to talk about in this session and get you talking about is what I've called 6 principles for remodeling church. In your own strategic plan, you say one of the key issues shaping the next 10 years will be to prepare for the regeneration of the church. by exploring diverse models of church planting. So that will take you to 2024. How do we reshape the church? So here are 6 of my suggestions of how that happens. The first is this: there is no return address. It's really important that you understand that this is not going to take you back to the glory days of the 1960s. So we're not doing this so that we can get enough bums on seats and finances that we can go back to the way we were and be happy. There is no return address. I was interested in these words that the Pope said the other day. The defining aspect of this change of epoch is that things are no longer in their place. We cannot simply wait for what we're experiencing to pass under the illusion that things will return to being how they were before. There is no return address. Things are changing, need to change, will change. And when I was here last time, I think I talked about this, the fact that too often we think of the early church as just reproducing what happened in Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. That it is the center. I'm always very pleased that I can do that. Should we have one more time? Yes. And you just roll it out. And I think that's the danger, that we just think we roll out the church we know in different places. But actually the image from the Acts of the Apostles is a very different image. In Judea, they kind of go with a Jerusalem model. But once the church reached Samaria, and then beyond that, the church begins to look differently. The center shifts. It's not just getting the center out into new places. Samaria is not a return ticket. They're starting to do church differently by then. The story moves from a focus on Peter to Paul. Church goes west, and the church is done differently among Gentiles. The first ever fresh expression of church happened 8 years into the life of the church. That's how long it took before they needed to realize, we've got to change the shape of the way we're doing things. They'd started with this great 3,000 people coming to faith, the day of Pentecost. They must have thought, this is the way we always will do church. 8 years later, Peter is on this rooftop, and God gives him this vision that says, actually, you need to change. Because you'd forgotten, as someone said earlier, that the church is for everyone, including these Gentiles. That God, as Peter says, realized that God has no favorites. And they had to change church. And the rest of the New Testament is all the kind of discussions that we have. Well, is this proper church? I mean, they're eating this meat that's not been offered to... Surely this can't be proper. They need to be doing it this way. And you need to be doing it this, And all those discussions we have were there within 8 years of the life of this thing that we call church. So we're only having the same discussions. I love these words of Vincent Donovan, his book, Christianity Rediscovered. As many of you will know, he was a Roman Catholic missionary that went to be an evangelist with the Maasai tribe in Africa, and realized that he couldn't just export American Christianity into that situation. The whole thing that we were just talking about indigenizing. And when he came back, this is not his own words, but something that was said to him about, okay, well, what does that mean then for young people in America? He said this: in working with young people, this is what this person said to him, do not try to call them back to where they were, and do not try to call them to where you are, as beautiful as that place may seem to you. You must have the courage to go with them to a place that neither you nor they have been before. That's what this is about. It's not about you saying to people, you need to come to us. And it's not even about us saying, we're going to go to you and then we're going to recreate our church where you are. This is saying, actually, between us, God is going to take us to a new place that is going to change both of us. And the shape of the church will be changed by that experience, as well as our lives and our practices. He went on to say this: this is not only good missionary advice, is a beautiful description of the unpredictable process of evangelization, a process leading to that new place where none of us have ever been before. It's really about thinking, how are we missionaries in our own land? In the way that a missionary might approach going to PNG or to Thailand or to parts of Africa. How do we approach as missionary people being in regional areas or rural areas or in the city? I love these words from John V. Taylor, who said this: mission is often described as if it were a planned extension of an old building. That's the way we kind of, well, we'll do this, and then we'll do this, and we'll do this. But in fact, it's usually been more like an unexpected explosion. Because often it is where God has suddenly done something, and he's at work, and we need to think, how do we begin to respond to this? One of the things when I was writing this book, I set myself, was to think, what is the strategy of the church in the Acts of the Apostles? And then I realized that for most of it, there was absolutely no strategy. They were just desperately trying to keep up with what God was doing. No one's got a committee together to say, what we really need to do is get Saul of Tarsus to join us. Now that would make all the difference. That wasn't the strategy. What they had to do was, Saul has had this amazing vision of God, has been transformed by this meeting with Christ. What are we going to do? And they send poor Ananias along to kind of check him out. And I think often in this, it is about saying, what are we going to do? Are we going to respond to what God is up to and what he's calling us to do, and the changes that might make? So there's no return address. We're not going back to the glory days. There are new glory days in new ways. Secondly, public worship services probably are not the best starting point. Now, I put probably because it does depend on the type of culture that you're working with. So that's not always, but I think that certainly in the UK, in the churches that are really connecting with people outside the church, they are not starting with church services, because that's not what people are looking for. They're not looking for an improved version of what they've been to, because they haven't been to anything. And a lot of the things that we enjoy are just strange to them, and are not going to be, as some of you have been saying, first places of contact. In the book, I talk about this, but for me, this kind of sums it up. It's this simple love, relate, create. I like to keep things very simple because I am simple. And I find that a lot of stuff just sounds so complex. But I think at the heart of it is this: love, relate, create. Love in the sense that, first of all, there's that vertical sense that we are loved. And that we are loved as we are by God. And that's his work of grace. He doesn't love us because we're doing this. He loves us because he loves us. And out of that love, we begin to love others, because we see them in the way that God sees them as well, that he loves them as much as he loves us. And again, he loves them because they are loved, not because of what they're doing. And love always sends us out in relationships, doesn't it? For God so loved the world, he sent. It's the word that we get mission from. Love always sends us out into relationships in the world, with those around us in different places. And those are real relationships, not just relationships because we want to get them into church, but relationships because we are loved and they are loved and we're expressing that love. But the third step is that thing of saying, what could we begin to create? Maybe as 2 or 3 of us, not just thinking of the whole church, or it could be the whole church, what could we begin to create to enable these people to connect with the person behind that love? What might be the appropriate ways that we could do that? And there are going to be as many ways as there are people in this room. Because what usually happens, and I've been guilty of this, is exactly the opposite. We create something, so we're going to start a new service. Then we think, man, we've got to get someone to come to it. So we better get everyone out there and get them inviting, and we need to make some relationships. And then some people start coming, and we think, we've got to love these people now, and they don't really fit in, and they're not doing the right things, and they're causing a few problems. And that's the kind of process that we go through. The other thing I've put there is that at the heart of this is prayer, is discerning what the Spirit is saying to us, what He's calling us to do. And the whole thing needs to have prayer at the heart and of all that we're doing in this, as we discern what God is calling us to do. But it takes us into very different areas. So let me give you a couple of examples. One of my old students, Sue, she was praying with some other mums about their local school in quite a tough area of Cambridge. And they used to gather and pray for the school. And they knew quite a few of the mums as well, obviously, because they were mums and met them in the schoolyard and other carers and stuff. But it's a very dangerous thing to pray. As they prayed for a couple of years, they felt God saying, it's not just enough to meet together once a month to pray. You need to be doing something in the school. You need to be creating something. So they prayed about that, and they started a group that just met on a Friday. So they would meet in the playground with their kids. They then go into a room that the school gave them to use and was very happy. And they invited the people that they met in the playground that they knew to come to this. And there was coffee, and there was something to eat. They had some music they just listened to. They watched some DVD clips. As time began, they used to talk about those. They began to pray. And over the next couple of years, quite a few of those people began to become followers of Jesus. Many of them had addiction problems with drug and alcohol and other things. The school was saying, this is amazing. You are connecting with parents that we cannot connect with. But it was just that simple. Love, relate, create. In fact, I remember Sue ringing me up one day and saying, Dave, I have a real problem. And I said, oh, what's that, Sue? She said, we thought we were just meeting with these people, but we actually think we've started church. And that's exactly what had happened. And in fact, it's the story now, 4 or 5 years later, has gone on because those mostly mothers, because of a Friday morning, then started to say, as their lives have been transformed and their community's been transformed, they've been doing some amazing things in their community. Well, what about our partners and what about our children? Because they can't come on a Friday morning. We need to do something for them. So they've now started a Saturday afternoon thing. And they now have about 80 people coming to that. They just, since I've been here, had 14 people baptized of all ages out of that. But it's a really simple thing. Or let me give you another example. A group of Christians recognizing, someone was saying about Sundays, that when they were in church, most of the people were out on the sports field. And where they were is a big rugby union area. And they were all watching their children play rugby union. There was a huge area with, like 10 games going on, all different age levels. And they said, this is crazy that we're in church when all these people are there, and we can't say to them, oh, you shouldn't play rugby. So they began to ask themselves, how do we show love? How do we serve these people? And as they looked at what happened, they realized that there was no coffee and tea, no refreshments at this place. So they thought, it's a simple thing. We'll go on a Sunday morning and we'll do refreshments. And of course, through that, they began to build relationships. And within 2 years, they've now started a messy church out of those relationships that they've had with people as they've continued to serve them and love them. These things aren't kind of massively complicated. They are just putting into practice this simple thing of love, relate, and create. Thirdly is this principle of who's this for? One of the people that became a follower of Jesus in Huddersfield, a good friend of ours called Sue, we didn't always meet on a Sunday, so there was a Sunday morning, and she was really searching for God at this point. She was a kind of classic spiritual seeker. And so she thought, well, the net's not me, but I'm going to go to my local church. So she went to a local Anglican church. And as she walked in, she was met by someone at the door who said to her, who knew her from the village, said to her, what are you doing here? Now, it wasn't he was saying, what are you doing here, i.e. keep out. It was, she said after to me, it was like basically he was saying, why on earth would any sensible person Come here on a Sunday morning to this if you're not already involved. And it's a really good question. Who is this for? As you know, I love sport. And the way I try and say that this is about is we are now playing all our matches away. We've lost the advantage of our home ground, and we are now playing away, and that's very different. Darrell Guda, in his book on mission, says, I think really helpfully, it's the way that we think of ourselves, how we identify ourselves. It's moving from church as a place where certain things take place to a body of people sent on a mission. And they are two very different things. So often we have defined church as a certain place where these practices happen. But actually, it seems to me, the way that the New Testament describes the church is a body of people who are sent on a mission. And which makes us ask the question, who is this for? David Bosch, in that big book, Transforming Mission, says this: the church is not the sender, so we don't send people out in mission. We're the ones who are sent by God. Its mission, its being sent, is not secondary to its being. The church exists in being sent and in building up itself for the sake of mission. In other words, mission comes before church. Our mission is what creates church, not the other way around. So the questions are, who's this for? Who is the mission for? Not who is the church for, who is the mission for? Because so often we describe ourselves as, who's the church for? Well, of course it's for us, and what do we like, and what are our preferences? But if we're a body sent on a mission, the question is not, what do we like? The question is, who's this for, and how do we make them feel at home? It's that generosity thing. That we will actually be willing to give up our preferences to make others feel at home. And that may be anything from where we meet, how we meet, when we meet. Someone said this: the ship is safest when it's in the port, but that's not what ships were made for. And that's true, I think, of us, isn't it, as the church? Okay, fourthly, and this is the relationship between evangelism and discipleship. And I'm going to get you to have a bit of a chat again for 5 minutes on your table. What structures and practices have you found most helpful in developing disciples in your church? What structures and practices have you found most helpful in developing disciples? And when I say developing disciples, I don't mean people who've just come to faith. According to the New Testament, we are all disciples. So what structures and practices have you found most helpful in developing our own relationship with God? That's really what I'm thinking about. Okay, 5 minutes just to talk with each other on this really important issue. I just want to do a little bit more with you, and then I'm going to give you a longer time to talk about how this might impact your local churches. So I want to think about the relationship between evangelism and discipleship. Those are the top two things you've put in your strategy document in terms of your core activities and values. And interestingly enough, you put discipleship above evangelism. And I think that was really good. I don't know if that was done deliberately or you were just doing it alphabetically. But it's interesting, those famous words of Matthew 28, all authority has been given in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all peoples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. In the Greek, as many of you will know, the command is not to go, despite all the sermons you may have heard. The command is to make disciples. It literally says, in your going, make disciples. And Jesus' strategy, if there was one, is the world's simplest strategy. All he was saying to this 12, and some of them doubting, so they're not the kind of, this isn't the A-team here, even at this stage they're doubting. He's saying, as I have discipled you, you now disciple others. In other words, the simple strategy is make disciples who make disciples. The end goal is not to become a disciple. The end goal is to become a disciple who makes disciples. That is the task of every single person in your church. That's why you need to think about the strategies and the structures that enable people to become disciples who make disciples. Over the years, I've spent a lot of time going to churches, talking to them about, come on, you need to get out there and be sharing your faith and talking about your faith. And of course, you look for a good passage from the Bible to base this on. And if I'm honest, it's actually quite hard to find a passage, and I kind of use one or two, but it began to make me think, why is it actually quite hard to find passages in the New Testament on, that Paul's saying to church, come on, you've got to get out there and start evangelizing. And then I realized that the emphasis in the New Testament is on discipleship, because the assumption is, if you are living this is going back to Leslie Newbigin, evangelism will happen. And that's why in the New Testament, the things that they're saying are, like Peter's saying, be always prepared to give an answer. And Paul's saying, answer in a good way, in a salty way. Because the assumption is, living out this life in words and action is just going to lead to people asking you questions. That is the nature of this thing. And so that's why I think evangelism is simply the overflow of discipleship. It is that euangelion, that Philip thing that just pours out of you. And discipleship operates always in the context of mission. Because one of the dangers is we then, I remember Christian groups when I was younger would say, well, we're going to work on our discipleship and then we're going to go out. And of course, they never got past the working on their discipleship. But discipleship always operates, and that's the way Jesus did it, in the context of mission. That was the way he discipled his disciples. He was then sending them out all the time, and then talking about what had happened and how it had happened and what they'd learned and the problems that they were dealing with. So evangelism is the overflow of discipleship. And discipleship operates in the context of mission. And if we can get those two things right, everything else, I think, will take care of itself. One of my favorite authors on this is Dallas Willard, who died recently, the American, who's actually a philosopher working in a secular university. But in his book, The Divine Conspiracy, he said this: we would intend to make disciples and let converts happen, rather than intending to make converts and let disciples happen. You see the difference between those two things? It's really, really key to understand that difference, that evangelism is the overflow of our own relationship with Christ, which is why this is a spiritual thing. And of course, this is part of our history, isn't it? That Wesleyan part of our history, John Wesley forming a holy people capable of being a living witness of the Christian life. That's the whole emphasis on that holiness movement, of the small groups, of the class system, was that discipleship is the overflow of evangelism. So then, as he would say, you get that fullness of God's love, that completeness of devotion and dedication, those works of piety and mercy in words and deeds. It's at the heart of what we're about as the uniting church, and that part of us. Interestingly enough, the NCLS paper based on the 2006 figures says that personal qualities play a role in faith sharing, probably none more than personal commitment to faith, however that's worked out. So when churches focus on growing disciples, they are also influencing faith sharing. Because we need to have something to say about that encounter today, not just the encounter we once had. Or the Methodist Church in the UK has now said it is a discipleship mission movement shaped for mission. It's in a sense going back to where it started and said, this is what we're about. We are a discipleship movement shaped for mission. And it is changing the whole way it trains its lay people and its ordained people to fit in with that whole process of how do we become a discipleship movement shaped for mission. And as I've gone around the country and the world, and the UK particularly, and I've asked people, what are the structures and practices for developing discipleship? To be honest, I tend to get silence, because it's something we do, but we don't think about. Or we assume that by being in church meetings, discipleship is happening. And it seems to me, we haven't got time, we could do another whole day on this thing, which I think is so important, but it's about realizing this is personal. This isn't about, we're now going to create a new set of rules for people. But discipleship is simply about following Jesus. It is about a person. Secondly, that it is a cooperative thing. You know, discipleship is not now another way of the church saying you have to try harder. Paul writes to the church in Corinth, and we are being transformed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory which comes from the Lord. So God is at work in us, but it's our role to cooperate with that transformation. That's what discipleship is about. It's not about pulling up our socks and reading the Bible for extra time or going to more prayer meetings. It could involve that, but it's about cooperating with what God is doing. It's about lifelong learning as well. I think that's one, I'm sometimes quite shocked. I was in another part of Australia, and I was talking to a key leader and I asked this question, what are the practices for developing discipleship? Because I think it's got to be intentional. It doesn't just happen. And they immediately started talking about what happens when people have just started following Jesus. That, as far as they were concerned, and these were key leaders in their denomination, was where discipleship started and ended. But we are all disciples, and I think the big thing I've learned is that all the time, school is in. All the time in our lives. And it's not just in those classic, I think one of the dangers of the kind of discipleship courses church produces is it doesn't produce disciples, it produces people who are socialized into living in church. That can be the danger of those things. It's so church-focused. But I think actually if you look at Jesus and his disciples and also our lives, where are the places that we really grow in our faith? Well, here are some of my suggestions. How we handle suffering. How we face our dark side. How we break through our quitting points. How we deal with disappointments. Even simple things like how we fulfill our personal commitments. Those are all places where school is in. And we ask the question, what is God teaching me through this? As well as the classic spiritual disciplines, which all need to be part of that. It's just understanding that discipleship is so much bigger than just an 8-week course. It is this whole point of God transforming us to be like his Son. Thirdly, it's communal. It's not something we can do on our own. We need others with us, who meet with us, who pray with us, who in good ways hold us accountable, whether it's through church groups or whether it's just meeting with other people. I have 3 other guys that I meet with, and we've been meeting now. We only meet 4 times a year for 20 years. And they've been emailing me as I've been here and praying for me and encouraging me. But where are the places where we are supported and encouraged and held accountable in the good ways of people who love us and want the best for us? And lastly, that discipleship is about the whole of life as well. It's not just, discipleship is just not about interior transformation. It is about that, but it's also about how that is causing us to transform the world around us. Whether it's our communities, whether it's creation, whether it's society. Discipleship is not just church-focused. It is also world-focused. Graham Cray, who has got 1 more month as the head of Fresh Expression, says this: if we're not part of a mutually discipling community, the culture will disciple you. And I think that's one of the shocks for us, isn't it? That we kind of think, well, if we're not doing discipleship, no one else is, so it's kind of all, nothing's happening. But I'll tell you where the best place I've ever seen discipleship happen. It's here. in the shopping malls is the best place, and they spend billions of dollars doing discipleship. How do they do discipleship? I think we can learn a lot from this. They give you the pictures of the life you want. You know, I just saw an advert yesterday I think it was for a Mercedes or something, but the images with it and the words were saying, this isn't just about buying a car. That's why we're not telling you how much petrol it does, per gallon like they used to. We're giving you this image that this is a mark of success. You've made it if you've got this kind of car and you can drive this kind of thing, or you've got these kind of clothes, or whatever it is. And it's not about the things, it's about the lifestyle that it gives you and how it makes you identify yourself and feel about yourself. So that's the first bit of discipleship. What is the life you want? It's talking about. The second is saying, and here's some people who are living that life. That's the whole point of the celebrity culture. It's a selling thing. It's part of discipleship. It is simply saying, here are some people who are living that life you want. Here is the embodiment of them. In a sense, that's what we're called to be. We're called to be the embodiment of the life that Christ has given us. And the third part of this discipleship thing is saying, so what are the practices you now need to put into place? It might be to do with makeup. It might be to do with saving money or borrowing money or whatever it is. What are the practices that you now need to put into place? And you look at the adverts in the shopping mall and on your TVs, and you will see discipleship happening all the time. I think, this was from Dallas Willard, I think if you're starting something new, these are two great questions to ask. What kind of people are we called to be? As human beings, not just as Christians, but what kind of people is it that God in his image is calling us to be? What would that look like? And then to ask the question, what kind of community is capable of raising people like that? Because that is one of the problems in our individualized communities. We're not all part of that, but those of us who are, is that we don't recognize that actually it's a community that's needed to form a person. Many of our indigenous people know that at the very core of their beings. What kind of community is capable of raising people like that? And then next is this whole thing that church is multi-level. Again, Rowan Williams says this, every expression of the church is, in its own way, another worked example of what they encounter with Christ looks like in the life of a particular community. And I think what I'm trying to say is that church is not just church on a Sunday at 10 o'clock or 9:30 or 9. That actually church is at multi-levels. Because church is wherever 2 or 3 are gathered. So you may well still have church on a Sunday at 9, but you may now also have it on Thursday around some mums and tots. You may have it on a Friday in a pub. You may have it on a Saturday afternoon at the footy. It's not just one thing that is church. That church is this multi-level thing. Because it's made up of, in a way, our danger is that we've always defined church as a set of practices. Church is what happens when this happens. Whereas I actually think church is a set of 4 relationships. It's about our relationship to God, the up bit. It's our relationship to the world in mission and evangelism through the out bit. It's our relationship with each other in the inward bit. And it's the relationship to our tradition and our history, which is the of bit. So the way that we can do church is huge. Because the issue is not, are you doing it this way with these practices? The issue is, what practices does this group need to grow in those 4 areas? That's the key. Practices serve the relationships, not the other way round. we have to continually ask, how are the things we're doing in church enabling us to grow in our relationships with God, to grow in our mission, to grow in our relationship with each other, to grow in our relationship towards the tradition? And if they're not, we need to change them. And in many ways, I'd say at the head of that is that we need to go back to a church that is visible. The church that is where people are at. I was just recently in Melbourne at the Queen Victoria, and they do this night market, and there are thousands of people around, and there are all these stalls, and there are people doing palm reading and all these other things. And I look round, and it's the same in the UK. Where is the church? Where are we? We think we're the visible church. We're invisible in here to most of our community. I was telling someone the other day that I've got involved in doing some running, and I'd run with my daughters and do this 10K races. And you can do it any Sunday morning in my area. You can find a race, often with 1,000 people. It's interesting. People say to me, "Oh, people won't get up to go to church anymore early." Well, let me tell you, they get up to run 10K races. But again, I ask myself, and there's often stalls and people selling stuff, where is the church? Where is the church here? Because church needs to be where they're at. We need to be visible, communal, doing this together, and thinking about how we're serving. And lastly, around that, it's not about leaving the tradition. I love these words. I'm sorry that this guy is a Kiwi, but I love these words. It's not about leaving the tradition, but it's about driving to its heart. It's in a sense saying, what is at the heart of what it means to be church and to be uniting? And that's why we've looked at Wesley and the basis of union, all these things, to say, this isn't leaving our tradition. We're not saying all that's happened in the past is useless. We're saying we need to get to the very heart of what we're about and then say, how does that work out in 2014 in South Australia? Which isn't going to mean it's the same as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100, and that has been a continual history in the life of the church. As I said, the early church had to change within 8 years. And it's doing exactly what the prophets did, which was continually say to the people of God, you need to go back to what it means to be the people of God in this new strange place. You've got to go back to the heart of what it means to be you before you can move forward into what that looks like today. No one's saying, get rid of everything that's happened before. In fact, quite the opposite. Drive to the heart of who you are. And then say, what does that mean for today? And lastly, very quickly, this might well change us. One of the dangers of thinking about evangelism and discipleship is we think, oh, great, this will change them out there, whatever that means. And actually, what I've personally found is it changes me and it challenges me all the time. You cannot be involved in God's work and stay the same. It's part of that transformation. And some of that change we may not like. John 12 says this, I tell you the truth, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. And I think one of the prophetic words in the UK that's come out of this is, what might we need to allow to die to allow new life to come? What might we need to allow to die that is good, but is not for now? Because one of the dangers for churches, isn't it, that we want to do new things, but we want to do everything we did before. So we're just going to add to this. So it's not really our priority, but we'll put it in around the sides. I think a prophetic question for all us denominations is, what might, and for us personally as well, what might we need to allow to die to allow new things to live? And that's really hard because it's giving up things that are really precious to us. But there is something, isn't there, in that picture of Jesus emptying himself, that actually God calls us to empty ourselves for the sake of others. I love these words from the French philosopher Marcel Proust, who says, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes." You see, when you go back to your churches tomorrow, when you go back to your communities tonight, nothing will have changed, except maybe the way you see it. And that is the key change. That is the key change. Okay, I'm going to get you to now talk for the rest of the time, you'll be glad to know. So you've got a good 20 minutes before lunch. I'll call you back just before 1. What I'd love you to do on your tables, I don't mind how you split this up. Probably if you've come from one church, it would be good to talk together. But to think about what might this mean for the structures and shape of your church, whatever your church means, depending on what you're doing. What might you need to change? But also, what might you need to develop? So in other words, you're doing something and actually think, we need to do more of that. And then I want you to be, if you can and have time, and if not, I would love you to do this outside this, to be specific. So who's going to do it? How is it going to be done? And when's it going to be done by? Otherwise, it'll just be nice conversations, but it won't change anything. Okay, so you've got a good 20 minutes to at least begin this thing of thinking, what does this mean for me and the shape of my church or the place I work? Great, get going, and I will shout to you in 20 minutes. Let me pray as you've done really well this morning. Thank you for sticking with this. Let me pray for us as we go to lunch. Heavenly Father, I just thank you for these lovely people here. Thank you for their love for you, and I thank you that you love them so much. Lord, thank you for their generosity as an expression of your generosity. Lord, thank you for this food and a reminder of all that we are given, and it also reminds us of those who don't have what they should have. But Lord, be with us now as we eat and talk. Assure us of your presence with us. And Lord, bless the food and our conversation and our time. Amen.